A long time ago, there was a man who went out hunting in the woods. As night fell, he found himself in an unfamiliar part of the forest. He walked and walked, but he couldn't find his way home. Wandering aimlessly in the dark, he eventually came to a small clearing where an old, ramshackle cabin stood. Tired and weary, he decided to see if he could stay the night. When he came closer to the cabin, he saw that the door was standing ajar. Poking his head inside, he could see that the little cabin was completely empty, but there was a bed and a fire burning in the fireplace. The hunter threw himself on the bed and decided to sleep there for the night. If the owner came back, he would ask his permission in the morning. Lying on the bed, half asleep, he looked around and was surprised to see the walls were covered with paintings. They appeared to be family portraits, all framed and painted in incredible detail. They seemed very lifelike and, without exception, each family portrait was uglier than the next. The hideous faces in the paintings made him incredibly uneasy. The way they were painted made it seem as if the eyes were staring directly at him. It was incredibly unnerving. He decided that the only way he was going to get any sleep was to ignore the hideous faces staring at him. So he turned on his side, facing the wall, pulled the blanket over his head and drifted off to sleep. In the morning, the hunter woke up to find the cabin bathed in sunlight. When he looked up, he discovered there were no family portraits on the walls, just windows. One night, there was a teacher at an elementary school in Japan who was working long hours and decided it was time to go home. It was 8 p.m. and it was time to close the school. So he packed his bags and left. He was about to lock the gate when he saw a group of dark figures in the distance. They were on the football field. It looked as though it was a group of boys kicking a ball back and forth. "Hey, what are you doing there?" shouted the teacher. "Come on, it's time to go home. I have to lock up." The boys continued playing and paid no attention to him. "Don't pretend you can't hear me," shouted the teacher angrily. "The school is closed. Quickly now, go out the gate." Just then, one of the figures kicked the football high into the air. It landed onto the grass and came rolling over to the teacher. When it stopped at his feet, he looked down, and the blood suddenly drained from his face. He was overcome with horror. It wasn't a football. It was a severed head. The policeman sat on the sofa with his pen and notebook in his hands. The old lady came in with a cup of tea and set it down on the table in front of him. "Before you take me down to the station, perhaps I should tell you why I did it, officer," she said. "The truth is, it was mostly for the company. It gets very lonely when you're an old lady and young people never seem to want to spend any time with me. I enjoy just sitting and talking." The policeman stared at her impassively. "Mrs. Ordway was the very first," she said as she sat down in her comfy armchair. "I remember it like it was yesterday. She came to my door selling beauty products. I invited her inside and made her a cup of tea. I went to the kitchen and fetched my axe. Then, when she least suspected it, I crept up behind her and chopped off her head." The next one was Mr. Bilgeman. He was a plumber and he came to fix my leaky pipes. When he was taking a break from his work, I made him a cup of tea. Then I took my axe out from behind the sofa and chopped off his head too. The third one was the paper boy, little Jimmy Watkins. I told him to come inside while I looked for my purse. He didn't drink tea, so I gave him a plate full of cookies. Children can't resist cookies. While he was munching away on the cookies, I began chopping with my axe, and his head came off as well. I stuffed all the heads and placed them on my mantelpiece. I talked to them. Day and night, I carry on conversations with them. It helps with the loneliness. The only problem was what to do with the bodies. I couldn't stuff them all. It would have been too much work. So I came up with an ingenious solution. What did I do? It was simple. I stuffed one of the bodies and used it for all of the heads. When I was tired of talking to one of them, I would take off the head, put it back on the mantelpiece, and put another head on the body. Isn't that clever? The policeman didn't answer. Well, I'm getting a little bored with our conversation, officer, the old lady said with a sigh. She stood up, took off the policeman's head, and put it back on the mantelpiece. Then she took down the saleswoman's head and placed it on the body. "Oh, good afternoon, Miss Ordway," she said. "It's so nice to see you again. How have you been?" There was a little boy who was afraid of everything. He had an intense fear of his bedroom closet. Every night when he went to bed, he was terrified. His parents asked him what was wrong, and he told them he was afraid that there was a monster living in his closet. The boy's older brother decided to prove that nothing to fear in that closet. One night he got inside the closet and shut the door from behind him. A few seconds later, the young boy heard terrible cries and screams coming from the closet. At first, he was frightened, but then he realized that his older brother was just playing a prank on him. A minute later, the cries ceased and the room was filled by eerie silence. Cautiously, the boy approached the closet and slowly opened the door. There was nobody inside. A pretty woman was serving a life sentence in prison for murder. Angry and resentful about her situation, she decided that she couldn't spend her life in prison. She began plotting ways to escape from the jail. She became good friends with one of the prison caretakers. His job was to bury any prisoners who died in a graveyard just outside the prison walls. Whenever a prisoner died, the caretaker rang a bell, which was heard by all the prison inmates. The caretaker then got the body and put it in a casket. Next, he entered his office to fill out the death certificate before returning to the casket to nail the lid shut. Finally, he put the casket on a wagon to take it to the graveyard and bury it. Knowing this routine, the woman devised an escape plan and shared it with the caretaker. The next time the bell rang, the woman would leave her cell and sneak into the dark room where the coffins were kept. She would slip into the coffin with the dead body while the caretaker was filling out the death certificate. When the caretaker returned, he would nail the lid shut and take the coffin outside the prison with the woman in the coffin along with the dead body. He would then bury the coffin. The women knew there would be enough air for her to breathe until later in the evening when the caretaker would return to the graveyard under cover of darkness, dig up the coffin, and set her free. The caretaker was reluctant to go along with this plan, but since he and the woman had become good friends over the years, he agreed to do it. The woman waited several weeks for one of the other prison inmates to die. One night, she was asleep in her cell when she heard the death bell ringing. She got up, picked the lock of her cell, and slowly walked down the hallway. She was nearly caught a couple times. Her heart was beating fast. She opened the door to the darkened room where the coffins were kept. Quietly, in the dark, she found the coffin that contained the dead body, carefully climbed into it, and pulled the lid shut to wait for the caretaker to come and nail the lid down. Soon she heard footsteps and the pounding of the hammer and nails. Even though she was very uncomfortable in the coffin with the dead body beneath her, she knew that with each nail she was one step closer to freedom. The coffin was lifted onto the wagon and taken outside to the graveyard. She could feel the coffin being lowered into the ground. She didn't make a sound as the coffin hit the bottom of the grave with a thud. Finally, she heard the dirt dropping on top of the wooden coffin, and she knew that it was only a matter of time until she would be free at last. After several minutes of absolute silence, she began to chuckle to herself quietly. Feeling curious, she decided to light a match to find out the identity of the dead prisoner beside her. To her horror, she discovered that she was laying on top of the dead caretaker. One beautiful hot summer night, a teenage girl named Julie was swimming with her boyfriend in the family pool. They decided to go skinny dipping. Her boyfriend stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her. He kissed her shoulder, and then they gazed at the night sky and dreamed of their future together. A few minutes later, they heard a strange noise that seemed to be coming from the bushes, but they were not paying much attention. They were so comfortable together. Just then, Julie turned her head to kiss her boyfriend, but she didn't see anything behind her. She twirled around and realized that her boyfriend's head was missing. It had been cut off. She screamed, and his headless corpse sank to the bottom of the pool. In a panic, she scrambled out of the pool and ran inside the house to warn her parents. When she got to the kitchen, she came face to face with her stepfather, who was washing his bloody hands in the sink.